They tell us these buildings were constructed. That word is doing an enormous amount of work. When I first began studying them, I accepted the explanation without resistance, stone by stone, brick by brick, human hands, human time. But the more closely you look, the more that assumption starts to fail, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to become impossible to ignore. Every structure has a childhood, temporary scars, mistakes, scaffolding holes, construction debris buried in the soil like fingerprints. These buildings do not. Take any monumental civic structure built before the 20th century. Railway terminals, cathedrals, capitol buildings, observatories. The story is always the same. Erected in decades when the surrounding cities were barely organized, when tools were limited, when logistics were primitive, and yet the finished product arrives fully formed, electrified, ventilated, integrated. There are no transitional phases in the record, no photographs of partial progress, no consistent images of workers living nearby, no supply yards large enough to support the volumes of stone involved. In some cases, the buildings appear in photographs before the streets leading to them even exist. That is not how construction behaves. The stones themselves raise further questions. Many weigh tens of tons, cut with tolerances measured in millimeters. Surfaces meet without mortar. Curves repeat across continents with mathematical precision. Techniques supposedly lost and rediscovered again and again, always just in time to explain what is already standing. Official history tells us these feats were achieved with pulleys, horses, and manpower. But the math does not agree. The timelines do not agree. And the silence in the archive is too consistent to dismiss. Where are the failed attempts? Where are the collapsed structures? Where are the abandoned foundations? A civilization capable of this level of construction should leave mountains of mistakes. Instead, we find near perfection, or nothing at all. Even more unsettling is how uniform the language becomes when these buildings are described. Inspired by, revival, neoclassical. Words that imply imitation rather than invention, as if the builders themselves were copying something older, something already there. I began to notice how often the phrase restoration appears in early records. Not renovation, not construction, restoration. As though the act was not to create, but to recover. And then there is the question no one seems interested in asking. Why did this level of architecture stop? Not gradually, not through decline, but abruptly. After a certain point, buildings become smaller, simpler, modular. Ornament vanishes. Stone gives way to steel and concrete, not because it is better, but because it is easier, because something is no longer being attempted. Civilizations do not forget how to build overnight, unless the ones who knew how were no longer present. What remains feels less like the work of ancestors and more like the inheritance of survivors. Structures without childhoods, cities without origins, and history already uneasy moves quickly past them. When construction ends, damage begins. And damage, unlike architecture, is supposed to be honest. Wars leave signatures. Fires leave ash. Earthquakes leave fractures that follow stress lines and gravity. Decay leaves time. But what we find here does not behave like any of those. Across continents, in cities with no shared enemies, no shared climate, no shared disasters, the same marks appear again and again. Stone that has flowed, not cracked, not shattered, but softened, as if briefly returned to a liquid state. Granite glazed like ceramic. brick fused at the edges, its surface altered at a level that suggests temperatures far beyond ordinary fire. There is no soot. Walls bend without blast scarring. Columns lean as if pushed by pressure rather than impact. Decorative stone curls inward, frozen mid-distortion, while the surrounding masonry remains undisturbed. If explosives were used, their residue is absent. If fires burned hot enough to do this, they left nothing behind to prove it. Even more troubling is how the damage is arranged. Upper floors are often compromised, windows warped, facades scarred, rooftops collapsed inward, while lower levels remain structurally sound, buried beneath layers of sediment, mud, or later construction. In some cases, entire first floors exist below modern street level, sealed, forgotten, yet intact. This is not collapse. It is coverage. Buildings are damaged, while the trees beside them stand untouched. Grass remains rooted. Wooden fences survive where stone fails. Whatever passed through these spaces did not behave like flame, shock waves, or seismic motion. Official explanations arrive quickly and always in isolation. A fire here, an earthquake there, urban renewal everywhere else. But fires do not vitrify stone without consuming everything around it. Earthquakes do not selectively damage ornament while sparing foundations. And renewal does not explain why so much is buried rather than removed. Then there is the silence where chaos should be. No mass graves, no weapon fragments, no defensive earthworks, no battle lines etched into the land. Cities appear damaged, altered, and then resumed. As if something happened, and then life continued, without memorials, without reckoning. As if acknowledging the event itself was the greater danger. I kept expecting to find panic in the record. I did not. Instead, I found calm descriptions of abnormality, engineers noting strange heat effects without fire, surveyors measuring distortions they could not categorize, architects quietly replacing materials without explanation. Destruction is usually loud in history. This was not. The pattern repeats too precisely to be coincidence. Different cultures, different eras, same physical outcome, the same unnatural interaction between stone and energy, the same vertical hierarchy of damage, the same burial of lower levels, as though the ground itself rose to meet the structures after the fact. Something acted on these cities uniformly, briefly, and with restraint, not to erase them completely, just enough to change them. Destruction occurred. But not in the way we understand destruction. When material evidence falls silent, the record turns human. And here, the voices do not explain. They hesitate. Across letters, newspapers, ship logs, and medical journals, the same careful uncertainty appears. These are not the words of people trying to convince. They are the words of people trying to describe something for which no language exists. Again and again, the sequence is the same. Light, first, not lightning, not flame. A sudden brightness and described as pale, diffuse, everywhere at once. Witnesses struggle to locate its source. It arrives without warning, without storm, without sound. Then the heat, not fire, not burning in the ordinary sense. Many are careful to make that distinction. They speak of warmth that presses rather than consumes, of air that becomes heavy, of skin that tightens, lungs that refuse to expand. Several describe the sensation of standing too close to a furnace, except there is no furnace, no smoke, no smell. In ship logs, sailors write of the sea remaining calm while the air itself seems to move. A white wind, one captain calls it, wind without direction, motion without weather, and then pressure. People clutch their chests not from fear, but from something physical. Physicians later record complaints of pain deep inside the body with no visible injury, organs affected without wounds, bones intact, skin unbroken. In some cases, patients lose vision within minutes, eyes undamaged, pupils unresponsive. The term temporary blindness appears, though nothing about it seems temporary to those experiencing it. Sound, when it comes, arrives late. Some describe a distant roll like thunder heard through water. Others insist there was no sound at all. One newspaper refers to it as still thunder, a vibration felt but not heard. Several accounts note the same unsettling detail. After the event, the world becomes unnaturally quiet. No animals, no shouting, no immediate panic. Silence settles first. Confusion follows later. What is most striking is the restraint in these accounts. There is no hysteria, no apocalyptic language. People describe what they can, then stop, as if continuing would require invention. Writers reach for metaphors and abandon them halfway. Editors insert disclaimers. Medical reports end with phrases like cause unknown and mechanism unclear. The tone is consistent across borders and decades, not fear, but uncertainty. These were people accustomed to hardship, to storms, to fire, to war. They knew how to describe disaster. This was something else. The vocabulary betrays the limit of their understanding. Burning air. White wind. Pressure. Without impact. Words assembled carefully, knowing they are insufficient. And yet, across continents, the descriptions align. Different languages, same sequence, same physical response. No shared theory, no shared explanation, only shared experience. If this were myth, it would grow dramatic over time. If it were rumor, it would distort. Instead, it remains narrow, precise, and unresolved. History does not suppress these voices. It shelves them, quietly, and in their silence, a pattern begins to speak. At first, the events appear isolated. A fire in one city, an abandonment in another, a population drop explained away by disease, migration, or chance. History prefers this arrangement. Separate causes, separate stories. No need for coordination. But when the timelines are placed side by side, when dates are aligned instead of categorized, something uncomfortable begins to form. The gaps between these events narrow. The explanations blur. What were once decades apart compress into years, then into months, sometimes into the same season. Cities separated by oceans experience sudden destruction within the same narrow window. Fires erupt without clear origin, consuming stone as easily as wood. Entire districts are evacuated and never reoccupied. Census records show abrupt population losses that cannot be accounted for by known epidemics or wars. And then, Reconstruction. Not slow recovery, not gradual rebuilding, immediate replacement, streets redrawn, buildings simplified, new materials favored, old foundations sealed and built over, often without documentation. In some cases, reconstruction begins before official damage reports are even finalized. The records themselves behave strangely. Our early accounts are fragmented. Dates shift between editions. Eyewitness reports are filed years after the fact or retroactively summarized. Technical details disappear in later retellings. What begins as uncertainty hardens into certainty, not because evidence improves, but because ambiguity becomes inconvenient. By the time these events enter textbooks, they have been smoothed. A great fire becomes the fire. A collapse becomes an earthquake. A vanished district becomes urban renewal. The language grows simpler as the timeline grows cleaner. What is never explained is why so many of these unrelated events cluster so tightly together across regions with no shared infrastructure, no shared politics, no shared enemies. The official causes differ, but the outcomes remain the same. Damage, abandonment, burial, replacement. In some cities, maps reveal entire neighborhoods erased and redrawn within a single generation. In others, building permits spike immediately after catastrophe, suggesting preparation rather than response. Insurance records, where they exist, show payouts inconsistent with the scale of loss. Then there are the gaps, years where documentation thins without explanation. Archives that resume abruptly, as if something in between was deliberately left unexamined. Mortality records that flatten, then jump. Construction records that begin mid-project, as though the beginning was never meant to be seen. No single event is definitive. No single city proves anything. But together, they begin to behave like one occurrence, viewed from multiple locations. That is the moment history becomes dangerous. Because if these were not separate disasters, if they were manifestations of a single episode, then our entire framework collapses. Cause and effect dissolve. Geography loses meaning. And the scale of what occurred exceeds anything we are taught to expect from the past. So the question is never asked, not directly. Instead, history divides the timeline into manageable fragments and names each one carefully. It spreads responsibility across accidents, nature, and human error. It ensures no single year carries the weight of what happened. There is no name for that year, only a pattern. And patterns, once seen, are difficult to forget. Eventually, the investigation reaches a silence too large to ignore. Not a ruin, not a record, but an absence. On old maps, those printed before borders hardened and histories became orderly. There is a name stretched across vast territory. Sometimes it is called Tartaria. Sometimes it is left deliberately vague, its edges fading into blank space. No capitals are marked, no dynasties listed, no dates of conquest or collapse. It does not behave like an empire. There are no kings to memorize, no wars to commemorate, no heroic epics passed down to justify its existence. And yet, its fingerprints are everywhere. The architecture attributed to later nations appears suddenly fully matured and strangely uniform across regions that should share nothing in common. Domes, arches, star-shaped fortifications, precisely aligned streets, repeated not as influence, but as standard. As if the design language were inherited, not developed. History explains this by diffusion, by imitation, by coincidence. But imitation requires an original, and the original is never named. When the destruction occurs, whatever its cause, the architectural language changes almost immediately. Pre-event structures are massive, integrated, and durable. Systems are embedded into the buildings themselves. Ventilation, acoustics, water movement, sometimes electricity long before it is supposed to exist. Post-event replacements tell a different story. They are smaller, simpler, modular. Ornament becomes cosmetic rather than structural. Stone gives way to brick, then to steel. Buildings are no longer part of a unified system, but isolated units connected only by roads and wires. Function is externalized. Complexity is avoided. This is not progress. It is retreat. And yet, no one acknowledges the loss. There are no graves for these architects, no memorials, no mass extinction recorded. Their disappearance leaves no cultural vacuum, only a technical one. The world continues, but something fundamental is no longer attempted. The maps quietly change. Where Tartaria once occupied entire continents, later editions reduce it to a footnote, then a region, then a myth. Borders overwrite it. Names are reassigned. The space it once filled becomes administratively dense, historically loud, yet architecturally diminished. The narrator is careful here. This is not a claim of identity, not a declaration of origin, only an observation. Whatever built these structures did not leave stories about itself. It left infrastructure. It left systems that worked so well they were mistaken for nature. And when those systems failed or were removed, the knowledge to recreate them did not survive. Civilizations usually explain themselves. This one did not. What remains is an intelligence visible only through what survives it, through buildings that seem to belong to a different set of priorities, through cities that appear to have been found, not founded. History fills the silence with names and dates, but beneath them, the structures persist, mute, oversized, and out of place, not demanding belief, only attention. The most effective erasure is not destruction, it is replacement. In the aftermath of the events we have been tracing, the world does not remain broken. It does not become a memorial. It becomes modern. That word appears in archives with remarkable frequency. Modernization, progress, renewal. Each time it is presented as a clean, forward-moving motion, an inevitable evolution, a natural improvement. But the evidence suggests a different motivation. Modernization often begins immediately after the damage. Entire districts are cleared, not rebuilt. Foundations are sealed. Streets are raised. New layers of pavement are laid directly over the old, as though the ground itself is being rewritten. In some cities, the buildings that replace the ruins are not simply new. They are deliberately simpler, less ornate, less integrated. Where once architecture was expansive and interconnected, it becomes defensive. Walls become shorter. Roof lines become flat. Ornament disappears. Buildings stop attempting to communicate with the sky. They stop attempting to impress. They become functional containers. This shift is not merely aesthetic, it is structural. It suggests a change in what society believes is possible. The reconstruction that follows these events is not a restoration, it is a covering, a substitution, a way to live on the surface while leaving the past buried beneath. And the institutions that should record this change, archives, universities, governments, appear to participate in the concealment. Records vanish, not in the chaotic way that fires destroy paper, in a systematic way. Files are lost at the same time across multiple archives. Documents are reclassified, misfiled, or declared irrelevant. Later editions of maps and textbooks omit entire neighborhoods, entire styles, entire eras. Even when physical evidence remains, the narrative shifts. The past becomes simpler. The timeline becomes linear. Progress becomes inevitable. Education, which should encourage questions, becomes a mechanism of closure. Students are taught that history moves forward in a straight line. Invention, improvement, advancement. Complicated anomalies are explained away as errors or myths. The deeper you dig, the more the curriculum narrows. This narrowing is not accidental. The world after the event is built on top of the world before it. The old layers are not simply beneath our feet. They are inside them. The streets we walk are laid over older streets. The foundations of our buildings are laid over older foundations. The modern city is a patchwork, not a continuation, and yet the narrative insists on continuity. After the event, architecture becomes defensive, practical, reduced. It is as though the builders who knew how to create the previous world were gone, and those who remained could only rebuild what they could understand. The result is a landscape of compromise, smaller structures, shorter timelines, less ambition. Something is no longer being attempted. Not because it was impossible, but because it was no longer permitted or no longer remembered. The reconstruction is not just physical. It is cultural. It is a decision to stop looking, to stop asking why the old buildings were so large, or why they were so precise, why they were so unified. It is a decision to accept the modern world as if it had always been this way. And in that acceptance, the wound is closed, not healed, but sealed. The pattern once seen refuses to disappear. The damaged signatures repeat, with unnerving precision, the same vitrified stone, the same warped facades, the same absence of explosive residue, the same burial of lower floors, the same survival of vegetation where destruction should have consumed it. These are not random anomalies. They are consistent outcomes, consistent enough to suggest a shared cause. Across continents, entire districts are abandoned at nearly the same time. Not slowly, not through decline, but abruptly. Houses left with doors still open. Streets emptied without the signs of evacuation. People simply gone. And in the wake of their disappearance, the reconstruction begins. A uniform philosophy emerges, practical, reduced, defensive. If these were separate disasters, we would expect variety. We would expect differences in how societies respond. We would expect a range of rebuilding styles based on local culture, resources, and knowledge. Instead, we see the same response repeated across different civilizations. That repetition is the first sign of coordination, not coordination in the sense of a conspiracy, no one group controlling the world, but coordination in the sense of a shared system, a shared mechanism, a shared technology. The idea is difficult to accept because it challenges our most basic assumptions about the past. We are taught to believe that ancient societies were isolated, that their knowledge was limited, that their technology was primitive compared to ours. But the evidence does not support that view, not when the same architectural language appears across regions that supposedly never communicated, not when the same catastrophic effects appear in the same narrow time window without shared conflict or shared climate. Something global happened. And it happened in a way that suggests design. The question becomes not what happened, but what kind of system could produce this. If it were a weapon, there would be proof. There would be remnants. There would be a record. War leaves artifacts. War leaves bodies. War leaves monuments to victory. This leaves none of that. No battles, no armies, no winners. If it were a natural disaster, there would be randomness. There would be chaos. There would be differences in the damage patterns, shaped by geography and geology. But the damage here is not random. It is consistent. It is precise. So what if it was not a weapon? What if it was a mechanism? A system designed for a purpose that no longer exists? A technology that worked until it didn't? A machine whose operation left predictable marks? A global network activated or failed, leaving behind the same physical consequences wherever it touched. And then, because the system was no longer understood, the world moved on, not because the event was forgotten, but because the event could not be explained. So the response was not to investigate, but to rebuild, to cover, to simplify, and to remove complexity from the future. The more I examine these patterns, the more it becomes clear that we are not looking at a single disaster. We are looking at a system that once existed and a system that no longer does. Not a war, not an accident, not a catastrophe, a mechanism. And the mechanism is gone, leaving behind only its scars, scars that are too consistent to be coincidence, too global to be isolated, too deliberate to be dismissed. The past, in this sense, is not a series of events. It is a set of rules, rules we are no longer able to read.